Okay, so these are your notes for 10.2 on social influences. Conformity and obedience. One aspect of conformity is called the chameleon effect. And this is where we unconsciously will mimic others. Call this like a mood linkage. So what this can be is, even something as simple as if we're around people who are happy, like their happiness can change into our happiness. And that goes with other emotions as well. And it's not that we're intentionally trying to mimic them. It just means that that type of attitude can be contagious. Unfortunately, this can also have a negative effect. With things like suicide and mass shootings. So we tend to see suicides grouped together, especially after a specific event. And same with mass shootings. Once we see one in the news, we tend to see a couple others happen right afterwards. And that's all because of this chameleon effect, this idea of mimicking others, and it's not intentional. But that is a form of conformity. And conformity is when everyone is subject to social influences in some way, shape, or form. It is part of our social norms. Like you, as a society, you want to fit in. And so you see something and you conform to whatever that may be. Solomon Asch did a famous experiment on this, which always kind of entertains me a little bit, and how this happened. So essentially what Solomon Asch did was he gave people a test that they had to take. And the test is right there on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And he said, you have to tell me which line on the right matches the line on the left, A, B, or C. And so essentially what happened is, like right back behind that, you'd have a panel of individuals. You would have one person who didn't know what was happening. So they were truly part of the experiment. And then everyone else at the table, or most of the other people at the table, were what we like to call Confederates, meaning they knew what was happening and they knew that they were supposed to give a false answer. And so the other individuals at the table gave the wrong answer. So when it came to the experimentee, the person doing the actual experiment, the majority of the time, that person went along and gave the wrong answer because everybody else was giving the wrong answer. So they very rarely would go against the group. And this could be considered a type of normative social influence. This idea that we follow people around us because we want to be accepted. We don't want to be the odd person out. The second type of social norm, social influence, could be informational social influence. And this is when we listen and respond to the suggestion of other people. We tend to be more receptive to this. We tend to listen to other people more when the task is difficult, if we are unsure of the answer, and if being right really matters, and we tend to listen to other individuals more. Obedience. We've talked a lot about obedience so far, and this is with Stanley Milgram's study with the shocking of individuals. So remember, Stanley Milgram did this study where he had a teacher shock a learner if the learner got the questions wrong, and they were being supervised by a man in a white lab coat to represent an authority figure. And what Milgram found out is that 60% of the individuals would give the maximum dosage of voltage even after the learner begged for them to stop. So there are two examples of this below on our screen here. And my apologies if I mispronounced any of this. The first one on the bottom left-hand side of your screen is Józefów. And Józefów was a city in Poland during the Holocaust where 1,500 innocent women and children were shot in the back of the head by Nazi soldiers as they lay on the ground. And this falls into the role of obedience because Many of these soldiers were family men. There was 500 soldiers, in fact. And they listened to the authority figure at the scene. And the authority figure told them that these people were enemies of the state and so therefore needed to be assassinated. And so they did. And one of the things that we find is that if there are strong social influences, so in other words, the people around you, and authority figures that you trust in, then you're more likely to follow along and be obedient with whatever they're asking you to do. More than likely, the soldiers weren't asked to shoot them right away. They were probably asked to do a smaller task first before they're asked to shoot them. So think of it a little bit of foot in the door technique. Now, although we're talking about negative events, it can also go for positive events when it talks to obedience, or in this case, a little bit of disobedience. Le Chambon, France, a city in France, was a smaller city that was housing Jewish residents because the pastor of the town was very adamant and clear that it is okay to go against those individuals in charge of the new government, because remember, France during World War II had been taken over by the Germans. He said it's okay to go against the government if they're asking you to go against what the Bible says. And so obviously the Bible mentions that we shall not kill or harm. And so when the Nazis came to this village, they asked and ordered that the Jewish individuals get turned in. And when they ordered this from the pastor says to the person in charge, "I do not know Jews, I only know human beings." And they went through the rest of the war without turning in any Jewish members of the community. They housed and hid them in their own homes, much of the time facing fear of persecution and starvation because there was very little resources to go around for everyone. But still an example of disobedience from an authority figure because their obedience lie with somebody else. So kind of an interesting twist on the thought of obedience. Group influence. How are you influenced by the peers and those surrounding you? First, social facilitation. You are going to have a stronger response to something if there are others around you. What do I mean by that? Well, if you are doing a task that you are very, very good at and somebody is watching you do it, you are probably going to do that task better and stronger when someone's watching you. However, this goes on the other side. If it's a task that you have not mastered yet, you are probably going to be weaker and not as strong in the presence of others or when others are watching you. Social loafing. Many of you complain about this all the time. This is when we ask you to work in a group of people and you don't want to work in the group because some person ends up doing all the work and the other people do not. There is a term for that, and it is called social loafing, meaning that because you don't have a specific responsibility, you can diffuse responsibility through others. This is also de-individualization as part of this. And this is when you're less self-conscious and less restrained when you are in a group setting. We find social loafing in all cultures, but not a huge surprise. It is the most common in the United States. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. Group polarization and groupthink. Group polarization, more extreme views can increase or decrease prejudice. It can increase or decrease any thought process. If you take a look at a political map, you see large clumps of red or large clumps of blue. That could be considered group polarization. You are maybe more extremely Democrat or Republican based on the environment with which you live. Groupthink is when somebody is afraid or hesitant to go against what the group is thinking or what the group is doing. So what happens when we go through groupthink is we tend to examine few, if any, alternatives. We are selectively gathering information, so not grabbing all information or all sources, only grabbing information that meets what we want it to. There is a pressure to conform to what's happening, and you withhold criticism of other individuals. Culture. This is when behaviors, ideas, attitudes, values, and traditions shared by a group of people and transmitted from one generation to the next. This can impact our behavior is because of norms, cultural norms that people might have. Personal space is also kind of a funny part of culture. But this is something that varies very much between one culture to another. So not just like how you greet people, but how you talk with people and how close you are when you talk to them. Another one that I find interesting, but it's totally accurate. One aspect of culture that a lot of people tend to have a harder time with is the pace of life. So what I mean by that is how quickly you go through things, and a sense of punctuality, meaning how on time are you. Power of the individual. There's social control, which is the power of the situation, versus personal control, which is the power of the individual. A good example of this is the Abu Ghraib prison scandal. And in fact, it was 3 individuals who finally stood up and said something about what was happening. Well, 2 of them went against them directly, where the third person just kind of refused to participate in what was happening. And there are also cases of minority influences where a small minority of the people are able to change what the others perceive or what the others think. The most famous example of this is Gandhi. Gandhi was against the British takeover, or wanted independence for India, and was willing to do it in a nonviolent way. And even though he was the minority of people, he was able to eventually turn and sway the majority of individuals.